All right, do you have the wine glasses?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so my name is Justin Ballerstein. I work at Halfaker, software tester. I have over 20 years in software testing. I've been doing test automation since the late 90s. And I'm pretty new to the government space, but I've been working with government contracts and test automation in the last 2.5, 3 years. And it's a little bit of a clickbaity title because nobody likes to be fooled. So I thought it might pique your interest. I wanted to talk about some kind of assumptions with testing and test automation, since test automation is such a key part of DevOps and being able to deploy working software quickly and often. So what I want to do is give this presentation for people who are not testers. So if you have some testing experience, that's great. See if you agree with me or not. These are all my opinions based on my experience and study and experience in the industry. So let's see if that worked. Okay, I switched slides. Let me know if that worked. You can type in chat. Or see. Okay, great.
You're doing good, Justin.
So I wanted to, I was picking out slide themes for this presentation, and I wanted to use the restaurant. I found that a restaurant is a good analogy for testing because you can use it to think about testing, because testing software can be a difficult thing to think about. There are a lot of really advanced techniques and strategies. And if you're talking about code and these advanced techniques, it can get very difficult to think about. So I like to, when I'm talking to people who are not in testing, I like to use an analogy with restaurants. So when you're going out to eat at a restaurant and you want to evaluate, is this a good restaurant or not? You can think about when you're going to the restaurant, you have a certain set of expectations going into what that restaurant should be like. And also, when you're at the restaurant, there are many unexpected things that could happen that would ruin your time at the restaurant. So I just want to set that scene. And when I go through here, I'm going to refer to a restaurant to introduce some topics. And if you're thinking about testing and some testing strategies, you can think about, if I went to a restaurant, how would I test this aspect of a restaurant? And then you can see how you could relate it to your software project. And when I'm talking about testing and the test automation and how it integrates with DevOps, and what are some assumptions that as non-testers I've seen people make, leadership and people in other roles, like in other DevOps roles or developers or product managers. I want to address, I need to address some basic testing before we build up to the automated test and the automated unit tests that integrate with the DevOps model. So I'm going to give some background first. Okay, so for testing, I'm just going to be introducing some topics that I want you to think about as I go through the presentation. So I want you to think about what does it mean to say that the software's been tested, and what does that test cover? What does test coverage mean? If you're in DevOps, you might be familiar with getting test coverage reports, and what does that mean when we have tested software, when the test coverage is high? And I want you to also be thinking about how does the automated tests replace the old model with manual testing? Okay, so for a basic testing concept, when I think of what a test is, you have software is basically a system. So you have some inputs coming into that system, some kind of processing is happening, and then you have some kind of output. So the test, you're going to have some test input that goes in. You're going to be observing what processing is happening, and you'll probably be observing and judging some output of that system. So that's the general framework of a test. And I'd like you to think about what makes up a good test. So do you think that doing the same test over and over again, the exact same step over and over again, is that a good test or not? Is it the same test? So that's kind of a trick question. So it could be or it might not be. It depends on the situation. So for example, if you run let's say you're testing the restaurant, right? So you order chicken and then you taste it and it's good. Then you do the same thing over and over and over again. So let's say you do it 10 times in a row. Well, maybe like on the 9th time, the chicken is undercooked, right? So that's strange. You can run the same test and get a different result, like on the 9th time, whereas the first 8 are different. So that's a assumption. I know there's a saying out there, stupidity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. But actually in testing, you can do the same thing over and over, and actually you will get different results. Commonly where I've seen this is maybe you have a very noisy logging system set up. So you run the same test hundreds of times, the logs fill up your disk space, you run out of disk space, the whole system crashes. So you might be doing the same test over 100 times, and on 101st, you get some different result. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, let's say you have a program, it's a basic program, you're adding 2 numbers together. So is 2 plus 2 equals 4, is that a good test? You think, okay, that could be a good test. But you know, maybe for your situation, maybe that's not a good test. Maybe the program is multiplying 2 numbers together. So your test of 2 plus 2 equals 4 is going to pass. But in reality, most of the other cases with 2 numbers multiplied times each other, you're not going to get the same as them added together. So most of the other tests would fail. So if you chose this one, it would be a bad test. So the big point that I'm trying to get across is that the quality of your tests, it's not a binary. This is you only have a good test or a bad test. It's really a big spectrum, and it really context dependent. And the other big component with testing is usually they're based on requirements, like your system, or you have some expectations of how the system should behave. And when you're writing tests, you could write tests according to those requirements. And those are basically a planned test or planned expected results. So, you know, if you're at the restaurant, you order, let's see, some wontons, and there's supposed to be 3 in an order, and then it comes to the table, okay, there's 3. That's your planned test. So I want you to think about, is that all that you need, is just those planned tests, the things that you thought of ahead of time for testing? And usually there'll be people on your team that will think, okay, we only need to test what we planned for, not what we didn't plan for. And later on, we'll see how that plays out. At that level, I call this basic testing. So you have requirements, and you have one requirement, and then you have one test case for it, and you have a mapping between that. And you may see, okay, we're covered if we have one test case per one requirement, And if we have 100 requirements and we have 100 test cases and they're all mapped up, then the software is covered and it's tested. So let's say you had a menu at a restaurant. There were 10 main entrees, so you're going to have 10 test cases. Okay, we've covered all the entrees, and that'd be a basic type of testing. But let's say there's an option to replace the side dish that comes with the entree. Well, now you've got to add a lot more complexity to your testing, and you start to go beyond basic testing. So I have just 4 examples here. There are actually hundreds and hundreds of ways to go beyond basic testing of an application. So I have 4 here. Hopefully these are, I try to use, since there are like hundreds of different strategies for finding problems, I like to use different memory techniques to remember them. So the first one I call dead chickens. So for, I think it's like Boeing, when they make those commercial airline jets, one of their tests is they take these dead chickens and they throw them into the engines to simulate a bird strike. So when you're testing your software, you want to think about, okay, what are the bad things that could happen? Let's try to reproduce those bad things. So I call those dead chickens. The dog that didn't bark, I think there's a Sherlock Holmes story where he's investigating some murder, and it's not, in order for him to solve the mystery, it wasn't what he was specifically looking for, it's what thing didn't happen that gave him the clue to solve the mystery. So when we're testing, we want to not only look for certain things, we want to think about what didn't happen with the software that should happen. So that's called the dog that didn't bark. The other one is trust no one. So many times we'll have testing caught in a trap where we get requirements and we just trust that these requirements are always correct. But in reality, that's not the case. Many times you'll get bad requirements, incorrect requirements, requirements that are not incongruent with the rest of the application. So just because somebody's telling you something, it doesn't mean you have to trust them and they're always correct. And then the last thing I'd like to consider is security testing. So it's been my experience with security, you can have a set type of security tests, but it can be difficult to think about how you're going to find a security hole until you actually have the application and you can play with it. You can plan ahead some types of security tests, but some of the big defects, it can be very difficult to plan ahead until you get a chance to experiment with the application. Okay, so that's just to expand your concept of what testing is and what it can expand into. And I really want to answer this basic question that's going to help you answer what is your coverage and what does your testing look like. So how many tests are possible on an application? And really the answer to that is there's an infinite number of tests. So you can give me any application you want. I could spend the rest of my life writing different tests. Even just think of something just as simple like PowerPoint, for example. There are millions and millions of tests that you can write for that. So what we do as testers is we reduce the tests that we're going to do based on testing strategies. So when you're saying, is something tested and what's the coverage on that, really we're looking at small slivers of that testing space that are being reduced based on our testing strategies. So when the team is looking at test coverage, what is the rest of the team and what are the clients, what do they understand about test coverage? Because you don't want to be under the impression where if you've got 100% test coverage that you're not going to have any issues. Or, you know, when you're communicating that information to other team members and the client, what are you saying to them when you say, oh, we're having automated tests and it's all covered? Because really want to think about, is it measuring the test run over test possible? Well, this one is not possible, right? Because test possible is infinite. Is it measuring the tests that are run over the test planned? Sometimes we might be doing that. And then, so the test plan, because that could be including things like the security testing or the dead chicken testing. But remember, those are only just, you know, the tester's judgments about what we think we could do to test the software. And then there are other reports that might say we're running the test coverage over requirements, would be that what I call the basic level of testing. Okay, so building on those tests, I want to shift over towards automated testing. So in the DevOps community, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the testing community, there is a thought of automated testing is really automated checking. And I'm going to illustrate that with some examples here. And I call that the blue orange juice. So let's say you're at the restaurant and you're testing and you're coming up with your test cases for the drink menu for the restaurant, right? And you're planning out your test. You say, okay, we're going to measure the volume of the orange juice. We're going to think about like what temperature does it come at? What's the acidity? What's the sugar? How long does it take what's the average time for the waiter or waitress to bring the orange juice? So you have all of these specific tests. But when you're planning, you didn't think somebody's going to bring you orange juice that wasn't orange, right? But if you have a manual tester and you're sitting down, you get brought that blue orange juice, first thing they're going to do is say, hey, something's not right. So this happens a lot in testing where manual testers will be able to pick up something that's wrong even though it wasn't planned ahead of time. So I call that the blue orange juice. And over the next couple of minutes, I'd like you to think about what kind of tests would you plan ahead of time if you were going to test ordering orange juice at a restaurant. What kind of tests could you think of to write down? Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is, do people follow instructions? So for the most part, when you have automated tests, they're going to follow the instructions, right? Because it's programmatic. Computers are going to run through it, and it's going to follow those instructions. But when people have test cases that have instructions, say you have 50 steps in a test case, people do not follow instructions very well at all. They're going to do it out of order. You're going to do it different every time. There are some people that can do it very well. That's amazing, but you'll find many people do not follow instructions. So, you know, you're doing your test and then you get a phone call and you come back. So that's something that's very different between manual testers and automated testing. And that informs something. Yep.
Let me ask you. So you're right. People are not really good in following instructions. Computers are perfect in that. So
yeah.
why would we even consider doing manual testing if most of the systems can be tested automated this way or another? Web applications can be auto-tested. GUI application can be auto-tested. Backend services can be auto-tested. So why do we need manual testing?
When you're writing automated tests, it's planned tests. You have to know what you're doing ahead of time, right, to write that test out. When you're manual testing, you're going to notice something like the blue-orange juice because you didn't think about writing an automated test to check if the color of the orange juice.
Yeah, the way I look at it, I call it like the happy path. So usually when you first code and do test-driven development, you think about the happy path. You don't think about these edge cases that you're calling the blue-orange juice case. So yeah.
Yeah, you're going to pick up a lot because actually a human is doing like 1 million checks per second as they're testing the site because you're keeping the context of what goal you're trying to accomplish in your head. You're checking 1 million things that you don't even realize that you're checking. So that's the advantage of the manual testing. It's not that automated testing is bad or that it's not necessary for DevOps. I just want to make sure that you understand what you're getting with automated testing is not the same thing as a manual test.
So this is Savanu. If I may just add a few things here. See, obviously, most of my clients, if you look at today, they want to take advantage of as much of automation as possible. But one thing is for sure that, okay, everything cannot be automated because automation costs more money, time consuming to start with, the design and all that. And it may not be technically possible to do automation for each and everything. So another thing to look at from a testing perspective is there is a big thing around customer experience, okay, that you cannot automate. So unless there is a human actually putting their hands on applications and looking around and going through the flows and all that, I think that is very key. You cannot find those insights from what a human interaction. You cannot replicate that just through automation. Obviously, there are tools coming up now, but there is a long way to go as well in terms of how to make that automation effective enough. So that is one other thing. And another thing also is the ad hoc testings, right? The ad hoc testing, like I think Justin was mentioning. See, while as a human, even when you are doing some testing, it's not only that part you are doing, but there's something else also when you are looking around and finding out, even if that is not on your test script, still you are looking around those anomalies and all that. So that is why sometimes it is important. And another aspect, the last one, let me just point out, is sometimes your application may not be ready for automation yet. It may not be stable enough to actually do any automation yet. But you don't want to move ahead with your building new features and all that until you have at least some amount of testing before actually you are going to the next step. So that is that is how I will just say that these are the things why manual testing is still required, but the importance is going down.
So to your point about application is not ready yet, because this is testing and DevOps meetup. From the DevOps side, we can say, hey, our application is not ready for auto deployment. Let's just manually deploy it. Like that's never happened. We normally start with auto deployment from day one because we are lazy and we don't want to do all the things twice, and we don't follow the instructions, so we know that will turn up quite fast. So why testing in this case is different?
Yeah, so what happens is, like, for example, so typically when you are looking at automated testing, just for the test design effort, you are looking at 3 to 4 times of effort when you are building those test scripts, okay? Now, if you want to invest on that kind of design effort, you need to be sure that, okay, it will give you my ROI down the line. But for example, okay, my screen is only 50% ready. Do you want to automate that now? Because if you do that now, again, you have to rewrite or revise your script maybe after 5 days or 4 days, right? So again, there is a rework effort, right, for getting those scripts ready. So do you want to really invest that time now, or let my screen get up to maybe 90% or 80% ready? Maybe that is the time, probably, no, let me do the automation. So it is a trade-off, right? Some companies, yes, they still do automation from day one, and they want to see, but obviously everything comes at a cost, and it is a trade-off. How much to do automation and how much to do manual. But the trend that I am seeing in the industry is get automation as early as possible. But I think most of the companies are still doing like N-1 kind of automation on the sprint level. So you don't want to do the sprint automation on the current sprint, but let us do, for the previous sprint and then go ahead with that. A lot of companies are doing. There are some companies are still adapting to in sprint automation. Okay, within the sprint, can I just do as much automation as I can? May not be everything, but some portion of it, and then in the next sprint I will try to automate the rest, so that in sprint I can still utilize my automation for my all my functional and features testing, and my N-1 automation is primarily for my regression and release. Okay, obviously throughout your release cycle, your automation scripts have to be still updated, because whatever you have done in one sprint, it never happened that, okay, that is like done forever. Like, you still have some changes, but at least some people are utilizing these two concepts primarily. Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense, or you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing people keep forgetting is that automation testing is just basically automating boring tasks. So if you have repetitive tasks you execute like every time, you try to automate those. So that's pretty much the main purpose of automation. So for example, if manual executing test cases, he'll be available from 9 to 5. But once you automate it, automation testing will be available 24/7.
Oh, let me disagree with you. For me, as a developer, automated unit tests, first of all, is so I write those automated tests, not because manual tests are boring or something, but because I don't trust myself. Yeah. I don't trust myself that I can write the code according to the specification from the first shot. So I write 2 pieces of code. One is implementation, one is a test based on the same specification, and try to work them the way that they finally agree with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is correct. And obviously there are multiple things why you want to do automation, but yes, but obviously, like Leonard mentioned, yes, repetitive tasks you automate for sure. That is where it started, but that was probably a view of maybe 10 years back. But today, if you look at now, it's not anymore like that. In fact, you want to use automation because you want to reduce manual errors, or something that you will not find doing something manually. Let us do that. And also fast tracking your overall effort. How can I move faster than depending on how many hands are on the job to do stuff and all that. But yes, but sorry to interject and take it away, but Justin, I think in the interest of time, I would request you, okay, go ahead with what you have to present. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of these questions are answered a little bit further on. Let me just touch on the pesticide paradox. So in software testing, this is just if you're doing the exact same path over and over, you have a reduced chance of finding a defect because it's taking the same path every time. And if you have manual testers, you have maybe have 3 different manual testers running the same test. Maybe they're going to take slightly different paths and have different assumptions about what the software should do. So you may be finding more defects that way. Okay, before I go to the next slide, because I've got a different answer in here, if you want to put in chat what other test you might do for testing a glass of orange juice, I have another test that would be, I think, difficult to think of if you were planning automated tests. But once you see it as a manual tester, you think, oh, why didn't I think about that? So I'll give you, 10, 20 seconds to think about what tests would I do to test a glass of orange juice? What would I look for? And we'll see if you caught the one that I had thought of for the next screen. All right, ready? There we go. Okay, so my test was the checking for a lipstick mark. So I wonder if anybody thought, oh, I should check the glass to see if there was a lipstick mark on it. So this might be something that you might not have thought of, but if you were manually testing it or going out to restaurants and evaluating, it's one of the things you might want to look at is, is there a lipstick mark on that glass? So this is the concept of looking for something. It's called error guessing. You look for some error in the program that has a chance of being there based on your guess, but it's probably not mentioned in requirements. And this is something that manual testers do a lot of. It's very difficult to think of when you're doing automated testing, because you're coming up with something that isn't there, isn't part of the requirements. So it's hard to get your mind in that space. And then the other thing I want to mention is that the test space of a lipstick mark on a glass, it's filtered. You're not looking in the bottom of the glass for the lipstick. It's actually in a certain area. So when you're testing, you're always thinking about, oh, how can I reduce the area that I'm looking at to speed up testing? Okay, so that was that one. Okay, so now I'm getting to unit tests that was brought up. Units are some best practices, but in fact, in experience, sometimes the unit tests are what we say they are. So I've reviewed hundreds of projects by hundreds of different companies at the for the government, at the VA, and also in private. And you'd be surprised at what some developers have done. So some methods could be hundreds of lines long. There could be some methods in a software program that are larger than an entire product, but they'll still call it a unit, and you could still have a unit test for it. So some unit testing actually ties a lot together. But developers have a lot of control over what a unit is, how much is in there, what unit testing is, and what it isn't. So don't just assume that your development team, or if you outsource to a different contractor, just because they have a unit test, it doesn't mean that it's actually testing a small unit. And when you're implementing unit tests, there can be bad unit tests. You can have some unit tests that do absolutely nothing. You can have some unit tests that just maybe test the compilation. Okay, the code compiles, or if it calls the method, there could be no assertion on the method. So on that unit, it might not be evaluating the output at all. It just calls it, and okay, as long as no exception is thrown, it's passing. Some unit tests will test the wrong thing. So you could have a developer writing a unit test, say it's testing one thing, and it could be testing something totally different. Some unit tests could be giving a false pass. So my example before with that was it's testing the add method, and you're testing 2 + 2 = 4. The implementation is actually doing a multiplication, but it still passes. So it could be that scenario where you just chose a bad test, and it's giving a false pass. And I want to talk about the automated unit test coverage here. So let's say we have a function. This is kind of JavaScript, right? So you have, you're adding those two numbers together. Let's say the implementation is this. So the function is supposed to add these two numbers together. But you see the code here. If x is 3, it's going to return 6. Otherwise, it's going to return 14. So we could have 100% line coverage, 100% branch coverage on these unit tests, expecting that 3 and 3 equals 6 and 8 and 6 equals 14. So what I'm just trying to show here, this is an extreme example, but if you're choosing poor tests and poor assertions, you can be showing 100% coverage and passing tests and just have code that does not work at all, that a manual tester is going to catch right away, because you're playing with the add functionality in an ad hoc way. Just because you have these automated tests, it's not a guarantee that your software is working. So this is my little sample example of that. And I just wanted to end saying that, so automated checking is great. It's amazing. It's definitely necessary in DevOps. But I wanted to stress that don't make assumptions that you're testing everything. Don't assume that the tests are the right tests with the right context, and don't let the team and your clients have the wrong expectations about what you're getting out of the automated testing. And really, your automated checks are very quality dependent. You can have some bad automated tests and bad unit tests, and they're really not helping out your team. All right, well, that was the presentation. Does anybody have any questions, any comments, any more challenges to what I spoke about? I can expand about anything if you're interested.
Does TDD resolve these unit test issues? It's a question in the chat window. It's a good question.
Couldn't that be necessary for load testing or load testing? What were you referring to for that question, Dan?
No, the question is about TDD. Does TDD resolve this
I
unit
missed
test?
in chat, sorry.
Yeah.
Justin, I don't want to speak for you. It almost sounds like you were talking about acceptance tests, like end-to-end tests. As a developer, I always write unit tests. If I sacrifice any kind of automated testing, it's usually acceptance testing, like Selenium, because usually that's very time consuming. But with unit tests, it almost feels like there's so many benefits. I almost think it's a kind of requirement. It helps you write cleaner code, helps you decouple your code.
Yeah, unit tests are great. I just wanted to show, though, that you can have unit tests that are not useful.
Yeah.
And the developer has to put a lot of thought into writing a quality unit test. And I think what this part of this wants to address and communicate to people, if you're in management or you're making decisions, just because you have unit tests doesn't mean it's going to be helpful or guarantee. Really, the quality of the development, this test code it's really important. And if you gave a development firm, say, okay, I want 100% coverage, I want everything unit tested, they could go and fill out and meet that benchmark without adding value to the software.
Yeah.
This is an extreme example, but I've reviewed hundreds of projects throughout the government space, and I've seen some terrible unit tests.
I think I get the
that
vibe.
Are not useful.
That's usually people who just want to code and not talk to the business partners. But for me, when I go to the business partners, writing a test up front helps you understand the requirement better. So when you take that approach, after you talk to the BP and do outside-in test-driven development, I think the quality of tests increases when you actually talk to your BPs. But not all developers do that. Some of them just want to write code and write unit tests and not really engage the business partner. And then, yeah, I could see how that could really bring in a lot of useless unit tests.
Yeah, and that's good. That's a good base to start with. But you know, when you get to the end product, it's difficult when you're writing those unit tests, especially at the beginning or with test-driven development. It's really difficult to think about what's going to happen in the future and how it's going to be used. So that's where I like to think about this kind of situation. This will happen with your product. You're going to design your tests. Okay, you're going to have a good solid base to work from. You're not catching everything. You don't want to tell your clients that because you're doing TDD, you're not going to have any bugs. Yeah. And you don't need manual testing.
Yeah. Somebody asked a question in the chat window. How does testing in the government space differ from outside of the government space? Is there a lot of like things you have to get out the way? Is there anything that you could think of?
Well, the government's moving aggressively towards DevOps and a lot of reliance on test automation, unit testing, TDD, BDD. There are some challenges because some of the government work is with very old technology that doesn't have the infrastructure to support unit tests, for example. So that could be some challenges in the government space.
You're talking about code, probably like outdated, really tightly coupled code. Is that what you're referring to?
It could be partly that. You know, you might be maintaining code that's 50 years old, you know, or, you know, languages that don't have a unit test framework on them. So it's not even possible to do it, or it would be significant. You know, you say you want to add a feature and it would take a month, but if you wanted to add on a unit test framework on top of it, you know, it's going to pull your project out 10 times. Those kind of considerations happen. So that's one thing with the government space. The other thing is you have different contractors grabbing government contracts to build out some software project for the government. And the government doesn't know how to evaluate. It's a difficult problem for the government to evaluate the quality of the code developed by the contractors. So they'll use metrics like code coverage and unit test and automated test to try to evaluate the quality of that code.
You ever heard of metric? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I've seen, you know, bad unit tests like that by other contracting companies. Just to meet
cyclomatic complexity. Have you ever used that metric?
Yeah, we use that's a great thing to help improve automated testing, and that's a good place to look because the more complex it is, the higher chance developer made a mistake.
Well, Justin, and how do you deal with testing data for products running in some special environments like, I don't know, top security or like environments where some kind of security clearance is needed? How do you manage data for such products?
That's a very difficult. That's a very difficult problem to have. We've used data from production and sanitized it or de-identified it. We have, I think in the government space, we have additional production-like environments, softer rollouts, so where we're not rolling out nationwide. I think that would impact the DevOps strategy quite a bit. And we also create test data, the same as any outside area would.
But isn't it too late in the process when software is deployed in those special environments and have access to like actual?
Well, yeah, a lot of times you don't have much of a choice. So with government work and government contracting, you might have a software product that has, let's say, 15, 20-year lifespan, and you might have 10 different contractors. So let's say you're in on year 12 of that software product, you know, and you only have a 1-year contract. Let's say for you to make up that that lack of appropriate test data, you know, maybe that take you 6 months or a year. So you don't have that time. So that's some of the challenges that you'll take, and it's just a matter of the structure of how government contracts operate. You don't have a small project, you know, that you can do in 3 months. It's something that takes could take a decade.
And going back to the data for tests, are any established processes which can tell that, okay, data was sanitized fine enough, so now it can be taken into like unsecured environments? Or...
Yeah, there's different rules for doing that. So HIPAA has guidelines, and there are different rule sets, regulations that you have to meet to certify something as de-identified or sanitized. And so each type of data set has its own rules about how to do that. And it's quite technical. You could make an entire career out of that.
Okay. And when you do data cleanup for again, to use it as a test, do you do some validation of the data that actually follow the patterns in the original data set? Like, just an example, if you have, like, let's say a table with SSNs in it, and you say, no, I don't want to store actual SSNs, I will replace them with numbers like all ones, all twos, all threes, all fives, and so on. And that will impact how your database index will perform.
Yeah, that's very true. And what you can do is different types of. So I've done some things in the past where you analyze production data, and when we're developing test data for automated tests, we'll use something in testing called equivalence partitioning and error guessing. So that's just basically picking out the types of data inputs that might cause problems. So if we're looking at first or last name per system, right, I'm going to look for a name that has apostrophe in it because that could cause a problem. So that would be one like classification of tests. So we'll have some types of test data analyzed that way. So we'll do some searches in production data for more unique test data, such as the apostrophe, or, you know, give me the longest last name, the longest first name, that sort of thing.
Is it one, or it's a repeatable process?
there are, I've worked where we have repeatable ones, and we've worked with manual inspections. The other thing we look at is a distribution of that data. So you want your test data to have the same distribution profile as production, for example. Especially like if you're storing data of different size, you want that same profile is going to impact things like your performance.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Justin, actually, I have a question. So once your company, and maybe Tony can answer this question as well, once your company gets a project and that is a legacy application, do you change your testing approaches to the application? Do you come up with better testing efforts, or how do you resolve this challenge?
Yeah, everything has to be customized to the project. One of the things that I think is very important is that the testing team, or who has the testing and development expertise, make sure you communicate what is happening with the rest of the team so they're more informed about what's happening. But one of the testing principles that we have is, I call it context is king. So the context gives you all the importance to judge if a test is a good test or not. Because, there's this function to add two numbers together, for example, really it's not enough information to know how to make a good test or not. Everything has to be judged within the context of the application, how it's anticipated to be used. But that context and customizing it for your team, it's super important because the number of your possible tests is it's infinite. You have an infinite number of possible tests. So you have to figure out how are we going to reduce risk? How are we going to customize our approach so that we can meet the schedule and not have problems in production?
And can you talk a little bit about the tools you guys using at your company, either for UI or for API automation? Do you guys use like Selenium or something else?
Yeah, right now I'm working on some projects with that are Angular. So we do some unit tests, Karma, Jasmine. We use the Angular unit test framework a lot. We're using Selenium. It's with Angular. There's a wrapper called Protractor.
I heard of Protractor. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and that it basically lets you use Selenium, but it looks for the page loading that Angular does on the site to know when the page is ready for the Selenium commands. But recently I've been shifting a lot of our tests from the Selenium type tests to the Angular unit test framework. It's really powerful that you can test views with Angular now without having to do the full end-to-end automation. So that's been a big time saver for us.
Hey, Justin, you ever heard of Robert C. Martin? He wrote the book Clean Code.
Yeah.
Something he always recommends
Uncle
is
Bob, right?
Yeah, Uncle Bob, yeah.
Yeah.
He always recommend. I think he never was a fan testing through the UI. Test right behind the sleeve, like right behind the UI. So if you're using an MVC controller, it's a little bit easier to do an end-to-end test instead of doing it through the UI. Are you starting to lean a little bit that way as well?
Yeah. In fact, for our Selenium tests, I do that too. So I have like an interface. So in case we have to ditch Protractor for another Selenium driver, or Selenium falls out of favor and some other tool comes up, I can use that interface instead of rewriting my test.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a good Pluralsight course. I think it's called Outside In Test-Driven Development, where I think they're working on an Angular app and they're using Jasmine and Karma and kind of seeing how you can architect your application and do test-driven development right after the UI. So I started thinking about Uncle Bob's book, and then I'm like, you know what? When I do UI tests, when I try to, it's so brittle. I kind of just throw in the towel because I'm a dev, and when it comes to time, and we only have so much time on unit tests, I'm not. If it's server-side code like C#, I use MS Test, and then I'm trying to get in the habit of doing client-side tests with Jasmine and Karma, but I'm not fluent in that yet. But yeah.
Yeah, we use the Angular unit tests, and we do a lot of the UI testing that way. Testers will get requirements, like if you have a web page and the web page has to have a specific, let's say there's a button on the web page and it needs to have a specific label. Like that word is very important to the client. What word is in that button, right? Yeah. So manual testers, they will look at that requirement. They'll write a manual test, in Excel or whatever manual test tool that says, go to this page, check that button text is this exact word. And they'll run that test manually every release. So some of those UI tests, like the spelling on a word, for example, would need to be run manually. So those were brought down to Selenium level, right?
Yeah.
So it logs in, goes to that page, checks it. Well, we can bring that, and it's really just a check. So we can bring that back down to the unit level with Angular and just check that button text as a test. And then we can use that, and it runs quickly, and you don't have to have the manual tester wasting their time on that. Now, there's other types of testing that works very well for automation that manual testers can't do either. So one of the tests that I like to have automated is a spell check on the web page. So if you're testing web pages, run a spell checker on it. It's very easy as a manual tester to not catch spelling errors, but the spell checks work great. That'd be another example.
Yeah.
I have a question about that, though, because the requirement that says that a button has to have a certain text label on it, that sounds like a poorly written requirement. Why should it be so strict? Because that's the kind of thing that has broken a lot of automated UI tests on projects that I've been on.
Yeah, we have clients that want very specific wording used because that communication to individuals can be very important. Where a word makes a huge difference, and you can't have developers assuming that it's okay to change it, or anybody else on the team.
Yeah, Justin, I work for an insurance company. Yeah, compliance and like the verbiage could be very, very important, especially when it comes to government and insurance industry. So yeah, it might seem like overkill in most industries, but definitely not those two industries, I bet.
Yeah, although I'm a product designer in defense, so I design defense and FAA air traffic control apps, and there can be a controlled process by which you need to change the text on something through user feedback. And yet, if you had a requirement that the user feedback conflicts with, then now you have a problem because your tests were tied to the requirements. That's just the experience I've had. Mm-hmm. And I've started asking around about automated UI tests, and the people I've talked to, nobody's really a big fan of them. Of the people I've talked to, who are mainly defense people and people who have left my company to work in other industries.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can waste a lot of time with automated tests. You can build automated tests in a way that make it very difficult to maintain. You can also write them in a way that makes it very easy to maintain. One of the examples of things that we do to help maintain automated tests is if we have requirements in a system, that we make sure that there's that traceability to that code. I've taken over code where you have automated tests and you have 1,000 automated tests, and let's say 20 of them fail. But if it failed, you don't know, is this a good failure or not? Because you can't look up that requirement. So that'd be an example where you can have a maintenance problem. Let's see if I'm going to look for a chat if there's any more questions. Automated UI tests, UI tests always breaking in development. False positives, in my experience, very little add. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that was answered. We have some projects where, so we have requirements that are pretty strict where we have to make sure that we've tested these requirements. And I can have 100% of those requirements automated with UI tests. And our code is not changing often. The automated tests were written in a way to be flexible so that it's not going to break when CSS changes in the page or something. So if you plan ahead and you make your, I think Nassim Taleb has a concept called anti-fragile. So you want to make sure that your testing framework is anti-fragile, where if you run into a problem, you just make the software better. You don't want to cause, you don't want fragile or brittle tests. And it's just really about the quality of your test code and your architecture. Let's see, James asked about governance process for developers for unit tests. Right now, I don't think we have specific government checks against unit tests other than we have guidelines that we have to meet. There are some government contracts that are requiring code coverage and unit tests. It really depends on the contract. Let's see, is there any other questions? Does anybody disagree that you could automate your tests and not have?
Yeah, actually, question, Justin, you just mentioned that you are new to the government space. So did your work, did your work change since you moved to the government space versus the private companies? Like what, I know some banks, for example, they have a lot of like compliances and requirements when it comes to CI/CD, so they cannot just deploy everything automatically because they have like so many guidelines to meet. So did your workflow and your approach has changed since you start working for government versus private companies?
Yeah, there are a lot of additional, they're called non-functional requirements. So that would be things like your compliance for the government contracts that aren't required in the private sector. So for example, accessibility testing. So websites need to be accessible for people with disabilities, and there's law for that. So there's additional testing and additional automated testing to support accessibility testing that I hadn't had to deal with in the private sector. That would be an example. And I see Brian asked, how does one bundle up all the different types of testing into a single coverage number? So what I was proposing is you can't really do that. I mean, you can say what your coverage is, but make sure you communicate clearly what that means when you say that you have coverage.
And what bothers me in terms of testing is testing for infrastructure. Because again, we do a bit of DevOps here. Like normally we expect that infrastructure is there, it doesn't change, or if it changes, it changes in really controllable manner. But when we try to automate everything and do infrastructure as code, that code needs to be tested as well. And
yeah, so one thing that you can do, that one approach that was taken, and I'm still dealing with that question as well, how to test your infrastructure as code. One thing that we can do is you have your automated regression suite. So let's say if you want to test redeploying a server, an application, you can run that and then run your automated tests to make sure nothing broke. Because if all of your tests pass, then theoretically your DevOps code did what it was supposed to do. One of the other things that I'm thinking about that might be interesting is to have write some back-end API components to your system called health checks that can check on specific information that you want to know that your infrastructure as code is touching. So let's say it's some configuration for memory or disk space, or some configuration or some health of the server. Maybe implement some API that can fetch that data, and then have your automated tests call that API to get that data and do your assertions against that.
Right. So normally we solve this through runtime monitoring rather than through unit testing.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, you can write some APIs and have automated tests hit that to check. I haven't seen what monitoring tools are out there. I know there's a ton, but I've been concentrating on testing. That monitoring is making a big impact in testing, though. There's a discussion in testing called shift left, where you want to do as much testing possible at the lower level, so like unit test, and then integration test example. But there's also a movement called shift right, which is basically testing in production. And what you do is you expose a lot of information in logs and high amount of monitoring, and that helps so that you're monitoring the system and finding issues that way. That's called testing in production. Yeah.
So do you mean right. Performance testing as a separate phase on pre-release? You just monitoring the performance of the actual system in production.
Right. Yeah. You invest a lot into production. You can do some techniques where you switch traffic, so like A/B testing, so you can route some traffic to the new system while the other traffic is going to the old system, and then you do that monitoring. There's some shadow testing in production, so you can build a copy version, fire up a copy version with a new code in production, and have all the calls and all the software work with the existing code, but just make a copy of that traffic and reproduce it and send it to the new version. And then you have monitoring to see if it's behaving as you expected.
Yeah, I can remember two cases from the government where this approach actually didn't work. Healthcare.gov and unemployment claims this season. Right, so maybe it was tested somehow, or intent was to test it in production, but when crisis hit, it didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of this DevOps work is it's constrained by budgets and investment. I think with DevOps, you have a higher investment up front, and over time, your maintenance costs they go up and down a little bit, but they remain a little bit more stable. Whereas if you skip the DevOps, you might have faster production in the beginning, but as the software system ages, your overhead increases, and the leadership has to look at that line and see where those two paths meet and make a decision.
All right. Any other questions? Concerns, comments?
Good presentation.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
Hopefully, I said something new.
And by the way, if you guys interested in doing presentations or speaking, you don't have to be the world's best expert to do it. As long as you have something to share, we'd love to have you present a talk or workshop. Just ping me and we'll come up with something.
All right, and here we stop the recording.